Plus, Tax Entertainment presents Blood Brothers, A Tale of Risk-Takers in Romania, written by Troy Bello the Prophet, narrated by 11 Labs. Chapter 1. The Beach Shootout. As the chaos erupted on the beach, Troy and Frank found themselves in the middle of a wild shooting incident. The two mercenaries weren't superheroes, just some Broward County risk-takers, but they knew when to take action. Without a second thought, they grabbed the two beautiful women and hauled them off to safety. Once they had escaped to a nearby alley, the women started to panic, pleading for the guys to go back and get their belongings. Frank raised an eyebrow and scoffed. "You want us to go back into a firefight for a damn phone?" Troy shook his head, chuckling at the absurdity of the situation. "These ladies, man, always concerned about their damn phones." As they climbed into their sleek black sports cars, Frank cranked up the volume on his sound system, blasting Snoop Dogg's "Bitches Ain't Shit." The bass thumped through the cars as they peeled away from the scene. Troy and Frank were known for taking risks and living life on the edge. As mercenaries, they didn't play by anyone's rules but their own. It was tattooed on their necks for all to see. They knew they were in for an adventure as they received a call from an unknown number, instructing them to pack their bags and head to the airport. Little did they know, their next mission would take them to the dark and mysterious land of Romania, where they would face their biggest challenge yet. Vampires, hold up. Wait 1 minute, you telling me you got Frank and Troy fighting vampires? This gotta be the biggest piece of bullshit ever. Forget it, I quit. I got better things to do than to read no goofy bloodsuckers books. This gotta be a joke. Who wrote this shit? Chapter 2. I guess I'll read this instead of being unemployed. After their close call on South Beach, Troy and Frank returned to their high-tech, high-security smart home base. As they settled in and sipped on Crown Royal, they read up on the intel for their next mission in Romania. The job involved taking down a gang known as the Vampires, who had been linked to over 1,000 murders in the past 2 years. The gang was the main supplier of Valiums and Percocets in the area, but they had recently learned to produce their own drugs, which were laced with the highly dangerous fentanyl. The vampires had become so sophisticated that they had even developed a reputation for gutting their enemies and draining all the blood from their bodies. But that wasn't the real reason Troy and Frank were being sent in. It turned out that one of the vampire members was a direct descendant of someone from Romania who was rumored to be a real-life vampire, with a reputation for draining the blood of his enemies. The U.S. government had already sent in Navy SEALs to take down the vampires, but they were ambushed and all killed. It was rumored that the townspeople had something to do with it, which was why Troy and Frank were being called in. As they assessed the information on their laptops, Troy suggested calling their old friend Neil Gandarilla, a risk-taker rock star from Romania who was handy with a steel. Frank agreed, and Troy quickly got in touch with Niall. "Pack your bags. We're going vampire hunting in Romania," Troy said. Niall was immediately on board, and he quickly joined Troy and Frank at their base. The three men studied the intel together and prepared for their mission. It was risky, but they were used to taking risks. As they set off for Romania, Troy and Frank felt a sense of excitement and anticipation. They knew they were in for an adventure, and with Niall by their side, they felt ready to take on whatever these vampire wannabes had in store. Okay, thank God we made it through that chapter. Now I've got to ask the question, vampires? We couldn't think of anything better than vampires? All right. I know you guys pay me good money to read these stories, but I think I need to get into the writing department. Chapter 3. The Arrival. The gentlemen settle into their first-class seats on the plane headed to Romania. As they fly over the country, they take in the stunning landscape of snow-capped mountains and dense forests. Security Frank uses his charm and charisma to entertain the flight attendants, regaling them with stories of the risk-takers' daring exploits. Upon landing, the gentlemen are greeted by a bulletproof SUV loaded with an arsenal of weapons and gear. They begin their journey to the worst town in Romania, an area plagued by poverty and high murder rates. As they drive through the town, they are met with a hostile mob of townspeople, armed with pitchforks and axes. Frank, determined to get through the crowd, honks the horn warning them to move. But as the mob surrounds the car, Niall pulls out his high-powered machine gun and shoots one man in the chest, causing the rest of the crowd to scatter. The gentlemen are shocked by Niall's swift action but understand the necessity. They arrive at the first location, a stronghold where the vampires have been producing their drugs. The gentlemen prepare themselves for the mission ahead, ready to take down the ruthless gang and their elusive leader, rumored to be a descendant of the infamous Vlad the Impaler. Now that this chapter is over, I want to run a couple of ideas by you guys and see what you think. Well, I was thinking in the next book, we can have Troy and Frank give me a raise for having to read all of this bullshit. After I have to read your books, my mouth tastes like I just made out with an ashtray or ate out of a dumpster. I mean, this shit is bad, but I guess if you guys are paying, I'm staying. Don't get mad, just a little constructive criticism. Chapter 666 Blood Brothers, Risktakers in Romania. Frank and Troy had seen it all. They were mercenaries, risk-takers who lived on the edge and were always on the lookout for their next adrenaline rush. But when they received a new assignment that took them to Romania, they had no idea what was in store for them. Their mission was to track down and eliminate a group of vampires that were terrorizing the countryside. At first, Frank and Troy were skeptical. Vampires? Surely that was just a myth. But as they dug deeper into the case, they began to realize that there was more to this than they had initially thought. As they arrived in Romania, they were greeted by a dark, foreboding landscape, with the towering Carpathian Mountains looming in the distance. The locals were tight-lipped and fearful, refusing to talk about the mysterious deaths that had been occurring in the area. But Frank and Troy were undaunted. They knew the risks, and they were prepared to face them head-on. As they delved deeper into the case, they found themselves confronting a new kind of danger, one that tested their limits and pushed them to the brink. But the Blood Brothers were not just fearless warriors. They were also risk-taker rock stars, living life on their own terms and daring to be different. And as they navigated the treacherous terrain of Romania, they discovered that sometimes the greatest risks of all are the ones that lead to the greatest rewards. Chapter 4. Plus Stacks. The gentleman decided that Niall would be the one to make contact with the gang. "Tell them we've got some big-time buyers from the U.S., Troy instructed. "Say that we're loaded." The plan was to lure the gang into a false sense of security and then strike when they least expected it. Niall went in alone, posing as a representative of the buyers. As soon as the gang members saw Troy and Frank, they knew they weren't police. Troy and Frank looked more like drug dealers out of Harlem, though they were from Connecticut. They had been all over the world, from Barbados to Miami, and had touched down in all the states and countries. This made it easy for them to slip in and out of places undetected. The gang made Niall remove his gun before allowing him into the factory, but Frank had his big Rambo knife hidden under his armpit, right down the side of his ribcage. It was almost impossible to feel with the gear he was wearing. The gang members didn't search them too thoroughly, being that Frank was covered in heavy jewelry. The same jewelry they had stolen during a heist a couple of months back, robbing a strip club. Being good and bad was a blurry line for the risk-takers, and sometimes they had to do things like that to pay the bills. As soon as Troy and Frank assessed that there were only about 8 guys in the factory, Frank made a quick move. He grabbed one of the guys by the throat and pulled out his knife quicker than Wolverine pushing out his blades. The next thing they knew, the man had a knife in his neck. It was like Frank was taking a hostage, but as soon as the knife touched his neck, it kept going through all the way. He had shish kebabbed the sucker, and now Frank was taking his gun. They took cover while Frank let off shots, immediately dropping 4 of them. 2 of them took cover, but Troy and Niall armed themselves with the slain gang members' weapons and quickly took out the last 2. It was a bloody scene, with fentanyl and blood everywhere. Troy looked at Frank like, "What the hell are you doing? We were supposed to be finding out where this fake-ass DJ Vlad is hiding." Frank grinned and smiled as he dug through one of the dead gang members' pockets. He pulled out a phone, went through the call log, and looked under Leader. He smiled and looked at Troy, who gave him that look like, "You lucky son of a..." Niall said, "So I guess we're just going to call Vlad the Impaler Jr. and tell him we want him to stop or something." In a comical way, Frank looked at him and said, "Good idea," as he pressed the call button. The 2 men were shocked and puzzled. What was Frank doing? A man answered the phone with a creepy vampire expression. They could tell this guy was taking this way too far. Frank asked where the fake-ass DJ Vlad guy was and who was in charge. The guy growled and said, "Who the hell is this?" Frank replied, "It's your mother's boyfriend, and I'm taking over your drug factory. If you want it back, I advise your mother to call me." Frank said it to infuriate the man. The man growled and said, "I'm going to kill you." Frank brushed them off, saying, Yeah, just tell her I'm looking for Vlad and I'll be here." Troy and Niall burst out laughing. The man heard them laughing. "Okay, that was good. I'm not a hater. I can hear you took some of my constructive criticism. Still not the best, but I can hear the progress. And now that I've got your attention, all my sexy ladies, when you're in Florida, make sure on a Friday night you're at the Shadow Bar for Risk-Taker Fridays. Ladies are free all night, and there are bottle specials before 12 o'clock. Shadow Bar is located at 2301 Northeast 5th Avenue, Pompano Beach, Florida 33064. For more information, contact 954-873-8998 at Risktaker Promotions. Chapter: The Narrow Escape. As Neil was cornered, he knew he was in trouble. He had run out of ammunition, and the enemy was closing in on him. Just as he thought it was the end, Frank appeared out of nowhere with lightning speed. He quickly moved to Neil's side and delivered a swift karate chop to the neck of the attacker, who was taken aback for a moment. Seizing the opportunity, Frank pulled out his gun and fired a shot at point-blank range, splattering blood all over Neil. But Neil was safe, and that's all that mattered. It was a narrow escape for the two of them, and they both knew it. Frank's swift thinking and excellent combat skills had saved the day once again. As the dust settled, they regrouped and took cover, assessing their next move. Despite the odds against them, the gentlemen were determined to succeed in their mission. With their backs against the wall, they knew they had to pull out all the stops to take down their enemies. As they waited for the next move from their adversaries, they took stock of their supplies and prepared for the next phase of the battle. They were running low on ammunition and knew that they couldn't afford to waste any more shots. Tension was high, and the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder. The gentlemen knew that they were in for a fight like no other. They had to stay focused, stay alert, and stay alive if they were to emerge victorious from this deadly game of cat and mouse. As they braced themselves for the next wave of attack, the gentlemen were ready to do whatever it takes to see their mission through to the end. They had come too far to turn back now, and failure was not an option. "Now that chapter is over, let me get something to smoke. I need some weed or a drink. It'll make this story better. I'm not saying it's bad, it just ain't all that good. Don't look crazy at me. Weed's legal in my state. Puff, puff, pass. I'm going to show you who the real Puff Daddy is." Chapter X: Taking Down DJ Vlad. The scene starts with the three men taking cover inside of the bulletproof SUV under heavy fire. There aren't too many options, and the men are losing hope. But then, a light bulb clicks over Frank's head like a cartoon. "Hey, Troy, do you think that building is as strong as our building with all the special reinforcements that we put in?" he asks. "Sure," replies Troy. "I don't think these guys got the money for all of that." "Cool," Frank says, hitting the gas and driving directly towards the building's doors, hitting about 6 soldiers in the process. Frank rams the truck straight through the doors, and as they smash through the wall, he screams like a crazy man. The men jump out of the doors of the car and begin the all-out fire. Frank, with a blunt in his mouth, a machine gun in his left hand, and a grenade in the other, tosses the grenade, blowing up a big section of the left corner of the house. You can see the sky from inside now. Frank is super stoked. He's on his Wolverine shit. He didn't drop the gun, pulled out his Rambo knife, and rushed 3 guys. He thinks he's playing Call of Duty when you just start knifing people. This is when you get to see Frank in his true element, running around like an apex predator, manhandling these guys, gutting them in the name of righteousness. The other 2 gentlemen pause for a second, and all see their friend go Super Saiyan mode. In no time, they've backed the leader DJ Vlad, a.k.a. Dracula's nephew, better known as the bullshit version of Dracula, into his room. Frank thumps his way through the gunfight, making more mom's jokes and vampire analogies to take them off. "Hey, you guys are the vampires? Well, I'm the vampire hunter, and I've got holy water for all you cocksuckers. Suck on this, Drax." Boom, boom. Frank is going straight improv on this clown. Finally, They kick the last door where they've got him and his last 2 bodyguards defending him. There's no way they can keep this up for too much longer. They still have enough ammunition to shoot out for the next 30 minutes, and these guys are busting shots. Saying that prayers were actually just taking their time, they took cover behind a desk, and Frank is rolling up a blunt. "I want to smoke one before we put a stake in DJ Vlad's nutsack," he says. Troy and Niall smile. Frank finishes rolling the blunt just as quick as he started, lights it, takes 2 good pulls, and passes it to Troy. Troy hits it 2 times and passes it to Niall. Niall hits the blunt once and starts choking uncontrollably. Frank and Troy laugh while Niall coughs. Troy and Frank spring up from behind the desk, going down the 2 last surviving bodyguards and backing the Dracula wannabe into the corner. Frank hunches with the back of his gun, and the man drops to the ground. Frank grabs his neck like a dog, leans over, and whispers in his ear, "Are you a real vampire?" The man is leaking from his eye with blood, looks at Frank with an angry look. Frank punches him in the face and asks him again, "Are you a real vampire?" See, now that's what I'm talking about. That's the only reason I stay with this franchise. Frank is the man. He don't play that shit. That's exactly how I do all my ops. Break them down to the last compound, get them, Frank. Chapter: The Monster Mash. Frank and his mercenaries had the head leader in their custody. Frank had heard all about vampires since his childhood, but he never believed in them. He wanted to prove to himself and the others that vampires didn't exist. Frank approached the leader with a smirk on his face, taunting him, "Is this a real vampire? Are you going to turn into a bat and fly away?" The man's face gave away his fear. Frank could see that he was just a mortal man, not built for the life of a vampire. He continued to tease him, "Or maybe you should suck the blood from one of the dead bodies in the room, just like in the movies." The man trembled in fear, and Frank could tell that he had broken him. Frank leaned in closer and whispered, "You see, pretending to be evil or leaning into that demonic realm is stupid. If you could see the horrors that Troy and I have experienced in real life, you would know that it's the last thing you'd want to emulate. We may be tough guys who know all about blood, but we also know all about life." The man nodded his head in agreement, and Frank knew he had won. The others watched in awe as Frank proved his point. They knew now that there were no such things as vampires, just evil men who did evil things. Frank and his mercenaries completed their mission and went their separate ways, knowing that they had made the world a safer place. Frank had proved to himself and the rest of the world that sometimes the scariest things are just in our imaginations. And with that, we end our story. We hope that you were entertained, and if not, fuck it. 2 tears in a bucket. But don't worry, we'll be back with another episode.